people will still join for the next few minutes. But I'd like to introduce my colleague and CEO of TDi Sustainability, Assheton Carter, who will introduce himself, but is an industry veteran and has been working on sustainability-related issues for the last 2 decades. And myself, David Sturmes, here on behalf of the Impact Facility, a charitable sister organization to the TDi Sustainability team that is focused on bringing prosperity to mineral communities, as I will elaborate on a bit further after Assheton has introduced himself. But Assheton, thank you for making time. Thank you for joining. I'm excited for the hour ahead. And could you please go ahead with a quick introduction of yourself and TDi Sustainability for anyone that hasn't met you yet?
Great. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Stewart Carter. I'm the CEO of TDi Sustainability. And TDi Sustainability, for those who don't know us, is a specialist management consulting company, and we consult pretty much specifically on mining and minerals and raw material supply chain, working a lot in the auto, electronics, batteries and jewelry industries, and really supporting companies in meeting their ESG compliance requirements and helping them become or meet their goals for being a sustainable business.
Thank you, Assheton. And as mentioned, I work for the Impact Facility. We are a social enterprise / charity that has been co-founded by TDi and Fairphone. As such, we have very close organizational ties. And the Impact Facility maintains offices in Congo, Kenya, and the UK, with a team of mining engineers, sustainability and finance experts that set out to engage with especially artisanal mining communities. At the moment, our work is focused largely around cobalt mining in the DRC, being the permanent secretary to something that's called the Fair Cobalt Alliance that Assheton and I will touch on throughout this hour. And we've also set up a gold-centric program, Lake Victoria 2030, where we bring access to finance to gold mining communities, trying to unleash the economic potential we see in the sector and address some of the very real issues that many of you on the call might be aware of. Given my own involvement with the Impact Facility, I will focus most of my insights today on the mining sector, but the framing and the wider scope of the webinar extends across the supply chain, and so hopefully we can draw learnings that scale across the different stages of the supply chain. But as we think about sustainability and sustainable business, that extends from the extraction of the raw materials all the way to the recycling of minerals at the end of it, and what we do at the end of a life cycle for a product. But with that, Assheton, as I said in the introduction, you've been doing this for a while now, more than 25 years. You've been one of the first to write your PhD on minerals and sustainability. How have you seen the responsible sourcing / sustainability landscape in the evolve over since the beginning of your career?
Great, and thanks for reminding me that I've been doing this for a while now. In my defense, I'll say I started very young. So you're right, from a business perspective, really we're in the perfect storm at the moment, probably more than I've seen over those 3 decades. Companies have all these very different demands on them coming to them all at once. On the one hand, we're in the middle of what's been coined a polycrisis, a theme that was discussed at Davos this year, and the term has been kind of cemented in dictionaries now, and there's now kind of conferences on the idea of a polycrisis. And on the other hand, we've got increasingly strong regulations. So there's just a lot happening at the same time for companies to have to deal with. There's a cost of living and rising inflation. The consumer price index in the UK has risen 10.1, and that's probably at the top end of European companies, but all countries are facing considerable inflation challenges. We've had announced job losses at Google and Amazon and Microsoft, who are all laying people off. We heard the other day from a business publication that there's something like 150,000 workers have been laid off in recent months in the tech industry. And not to mention a pending and similar trend in the auto industry as businesses, prepare themselves for the headwinds of a recession and strive to cut costs. And of course, we've just passed that 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, the first very serious war in Europe since the Second World War. And according to the Global Peace Index, we've seen a decline in the global freedom for 16 consecutive years. So the world is getting a more violent and scary place, according to these metrics. And then we have supply chain issues across the board, even hitting over here in the UK, our supermarkets, where you can't get many vegetables. And alongside Biden and Europe moving towards greater protectionism, there's speculation, of course, or ideas that we've actually reached peak globalization. So globalization, which has been the force that has stabilized our global economy, and some would say have generated a peace dividend for the last 30 years. People say this is now peaking as well. And so this is a change of tack in how global trade happens. The CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, said in his letter to his shareholders last year in 2022 that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put an end to the globalization that we've experienced over the last 3 decades. And this leaves many communities and businesses feeling a bit isolated and unsure of how to develop their strategies. And the scheme of things, this all happened very quickly, and companies are having to learn how to respond equally quickly. So all these factors make it generally a more complex and expensive to do better business in 2023 than I have experienced over the last 3 decades.
Do you see that as an excuse not to step in? Because at the same time, we've had, beginning of this year, we had EU regulation that was passed that was similar to the Inflation Reduction Act and its impacts, or the Dodd-Frank regulation earlier on. And the expectation of consumers is shifting, right? 10 years ago, it was a fringe occurrence, the idea of sustainability, responsible sourcing, but the amount of media coverage that I personally perceive, especially around cobalt, where I put most of my attention, is just astounding. So there's a very much heightened consumer awareness of some of the challenges we face across the supply chain. And so do you think companies can afford not to take action at this stage?
No, well, you're quite right in that we have these mounting pressures from this poly crisis coming at business at all different directions. But at the same time, we've got rising expectations on how businesses should be more accountable and more sustainable. And this is beginning to emerge in regulations. They're being asked to audit everything, know where everything comes from up their supply chain, make everything low carbon, decarbonize, invest into circularity, clean up their packaging trail, and provide more for their employees as well. But at a time, of course, when there is little money to invest, including from the governments themselves. So it's becoming more and more difficult. So yes, these expectations are there, and not that companies are looking for excuses, but there's very little kind of space to maneuver. So companies are going to have to figure out how to respond to the different crises in this poly crisis, but also demonstrate that they are also meeting expectations for corporate accountability.
I'm also a consumer, as we all are, and inflation has been palpable for people across Europe and the US over the last years. I'm based out of Nairobi, and also here prices from food to mobile phones to cars, transport, everything has gone up. So how does the pressure of trying to be more sustainable, do business more responsible, actually fit from a business sense? Is it affordable or feasible to do better? Because globally speaking, there's a lot of brands that are not facing any scrutiny or pressure. It is largely the publicly listed companies that we're looking at, the big brands that have hero products, but can we remain competitive without huge increases in pricing to consumers? And is better business actually possible from a business perspective?
Well, again, I think there's very little room for maneuver. Companies are going to have to demonstrate they can do both. So whether they can remain competitive, of course, will depend on the jurisdictional environment they're in and the competitive environment they're in. What we do see at the moment is a jockeying between the EU and the US to become the global policeman when it comes to ESG. If you're reading the Financial Times this week, you'll see there's several articles on that, and we have seen that the US is now leading the way in setting the expectations, the regulatory expectations, and now we're seeing a response from the EU, which is doing the same. This is what you see in the Ouija Protection Act, Forced Labor Protection Act, and then echoed then by the EU with the recommendation on forced labor. You see in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and then you see that in the EU as well, which is being followed by a similar set of measures too. And all of these have within them ESG or sustainability aspects, and this is only hotting up. So for sure, companies are going to have to compete with this in the environment, but what we should be looking at, I think, is whether those policy frameworks are aligned, or we will see, as we are seeing already, companies moving jurisdictions to take advantage of more favorable regulatory circumstances. But as I'd say, there's no getting away from the very sticky ESG and sustainability expectations that have been held out for companies. What companies can do, of course, is look to see how they can be more efficient in doing these things, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later as well.
So clear takeaway that we have to do it. How is then the follow-up question? How do we meet these rising and increasingly stringent expectations, given that there are supply chain issues and that there are commercial pressures on companies?
Right, and I think this, and how we do it, I think one thing we have got to move away from is individual companies being an island in addressing the sustainability issues which they're being asked to address. So no one company can resolve all the sustainability issues and development issues, nor can a whole industry do it. So we have to start thinking about what is the part of individual companies and industries within the ecosystem of government, civil society, and international trade. And I think a part of that is really about how companies can use the different instruments at their disposal, one of which is their own kind of policies and codes of conducts and how they work in supply chains. And another, of course, is the philanthropic aspect as well. Can we use these two things? Can we use these two things together? Talking about the ecosystem, I think one thing I've seen shift considerably over the last 30 years is what I would call the corporate responsibility scope. So what is it that companies are being asked to respond to? Which stakeholders are they asked to engage and contribute things to? And that has moved from 30 years ago being strictly about inside defense and being the employees to communities directly outside a plant or a facility, their neighbors. But now it's been pushed right up the supply chain to communities many thousands of miles away. And then another thing I think which has shifted, and I just mentioned really, is how the movement has gone to, or the lines have been blurred between what is considered philanthropic and charitable donations and what is considered to be inside the fence of the business model and the core business strategy. But I guess I'll turn the question around to you, David, as working in an international development organization. Where do you see that there is a bridge between the philanthropic and the business strategies of companies, especially in mineral supply chains, what do you think they should be responsible for, and how do you think they should engage in some of these problems, which are, you could say, traditionally far outside the natural boundaries of corporate responsibility?
It's quite interesting engaging with companies, because obviously companies are sometimes perceived as a single unit, but then there are very many different departments to engage with, and then individuals within those departments. And for me personally, as we look at fundraising or getting support for our program in Congo, with the gold program, sometimes we talk to the responsible sourcing team that is directly involved in supply engagements and forging a supply chain. Sometimes they refer me to their corporate social responsibility team, and they're distinct departments in many organizations. And sometimes we talk to the marketing team. And then that reflects then how companies perceive the value of engaging, whether it's part of their drive to get responsible material into their supply chain, whether it's perceived as something that they have to do because of CSR expectations or CSR objectives that they've set themselves, or whether it's something that where they believe they can draw marketing value from that. And then there's a thin line then between meaningful change on the ground and then greenwashing, while still trying to get those corporate funds behind the projects that we are building. The interesting thing, I think, overall is just that I think, or I hope that I'm observing a convergence of CSR and responsible sourcing. Often, as to your point about stakeholders, often CSR project focused on the communities around the workforce. So you would reinvest into schooling or education or programs for the children of employees or their wider well-being, the environment they live in. But realizing the complexity of our supply chains, and that someone that purchases a phone in New York or London is interlinked with people from the tin mines in Congo, there has been a shift now, and so we see oftentimes also a collaboration between a corporate foundation and responsible sourcing teams, where we try to bring in both philanthropic money, but also marketing or sourcing budgets to actually engage and bring about more meaningful change.
Yeah, I mean, I think for as long as I can remember, I started in this line of work. There's been proclamations and conferences that says CSR is going mainstream, or corporate sustainability is going mainstream. But maybe now this is a time when we should be more confident about that, because if a company focuses only on the compliance elements of its the compliance strategy that it has at its disposal, that isn't going to address the problem if it's too narrow a focus. If it only focuses on philanthropic, which is detached from its own strategy, that's not going to be sustainable from a business point of view either, nor is it going to address the problem. So is there a way that we can bring together both the ESG compliance and the SDG philanthropy, and then we can perhaps get at the root cause of the problems that created the ESG risk in the first place. And I know you work in the Impact Facility with the idea of kind of blended finance. Is this something that you're seeing, or at least something you're trying to bring about in your engagement of supply chain?
So yeah, maybe to expand on the concept of blended finance, it's figuring out how we can have more sustainable interventions as such. If something is 100% grant financed, you're always relying on that grant financing to continue. Whereas if it's only commercially financed, then it makes it very difficult to make it inclusive of more vulnerable stakeholders, where there might not be an immediate business case. And so with blended finance, what we try to do is mix development monies that could come from governments, institutional donors, philanthropic giving, with corporate funds and also impact investment, trying to come up with a way that we gradually decrease the amount of donations necessary to sustain an intervention, but from the beginning aim for building something that is self-sustaining and as such scalable and replicable, and that's really important if we want to address issues at the scale that they occur. And if we start thinking about these challenges or issues as opportunities, because especially when we look at artisanal mining, we talk about small and medium-sized enterprises in the mining sector that are very entrepreneurial in spirit. we can unlock, especially at scale, I think, opportunities for larger scale commercial engagement in the future. But we need that transition from initially engaging through a philanthropic or development-focused approach to then very consciously introducing commercial and impact financing to do that. And key to that is multi-stakeholder action. We cannot expect a company that is headquartered in the US or in Europe to solve the development issues of the Congo, but they have a role to play within that. And so do obviously local actors that need to be in the driving seat and designing these interventions and helping us prioritize what is needed, and governments, both international and local, because without those, change is very, very difficult to achieve, especially lasting change.
Yeah, and it's if I go back to, you know, when I was at business school and looking at stakeholder theory and corporate stakeholder theory, you always used to have this image of the company at the middle of the circle, and there were they, and then the stakeholders surrounding them. So it put the company at the center and how to respond to some of these issues, which I think is the wrong way around, because what we're talking about nowadays is about the kind of the root problems, root development problems, or the root governance problems that are present in many countries and communities. And it's not a company-only problem. And in some ways, it's a bit arrogant to think that a company can solve all of these things. So really what we try and do when we are, you know, framing a problem is we try and put the problem in the center of that circle, and then the company is one stakeholder in participating in trying to solve that. And I think that's what we need to be able to distinguish between what is a compliance risk, a risk to a company's legal standing and reputation, and what is a development challenge or development problem that we have to kind of pool our resources to develop. So I guess when you're approaching businesses in the supply chain and trying to get them interested in contributing in some way to addressing the issues, some of these root problems to do with artisanal miners in the DRC or gold mining communities and their access to renewable energy in Kenya, how do you convince them? What do you persuade? What's in it for the companies? Why should the companies care at all? Why is it their problem? Give us an insight, David, into how you can be so persuasive.
Only I was. From a compliance perspective, and I think we'll touch on that a bit later or throughout the discussion, it is possible to just avoid being part of the solution. Most commodities are not located solely in one location, and so it's easy for the people that care about sustainability to then move elsewhere, and maybe they pay a little bit more, but then they get their aluminium or their cobalt from Australia instead of places where it might be more challenging, especially with cobalt, where 70% come from the Congo, and companies are not sure how to address those challenges in isolation. But consumer sentiment has shifted, and a good indication for that of public opinion is a book that recently was published and that was put on the 10 books to read by the New York Times 2023. A professor called by the name of Kara wrote a book about cobalt red, and paints a very dire picture about the state of the sector, much of which I would agree with, but comes to a conclusion: we're all implicated in this. And rather than corporate stepping back and saying, well, it's the consumer's fault because they're using our phone, it's companies that need to step in and be part of the solution. And so that is, I think, being substantiated now with media and in consumer requests for companies to showcase what they are doing to actually solve that. And looking at a longer term horizon, regulation follows public opinion. So 5 to 10 years from now, there might be more stringent requirements that actually oblige you to invest upstream or showcase what you're doing. But for now, I think it's the public pressure that puts especially the hero brands that everybody thinks of, the Apples and Teslas, into a position where they need to take action and then actually be part of the solution. And if we think about it from what due diligence and compliance was supposed to do, is to protect the interest of upstream communities, where we find risks to human rights, and especially in the context of child labor, where we have concerns that children are being exploited in one way or another. We are supposed to continue to engage and contribute through collective action to finding a solution and remediate child labor, not avoid it, but actually make sure that if children are at the center of our concern, that their needs are being met. And this is something that is linked to artisanal mining, right? Artisanal mining is defined as very rudimentary, primitive mining. It's the equivalent of subsistence farming in the mining sector. It's a sector that has that measures more than 40 million people across different commodities, and for some reason, cobalt was singled out by media and NGOs as something that then drew a lot of attention. But fact is that the artisanal mining sector is part of the mining fabric as it stands. It's here to stay. It's not going away. Quite the opposite. We anticipate that with climate change, sub-Saharan Africa is going to become more and more difficult to farm. People subsidize or substitute their income from farming by going into artisanal mining. A great example for that is Ghana, where a lot of the cocoa farmers mine on the side. And so it's sometimes a seasonal activity, sometimes it's throughout the year or within the household that one person would be engaged in farming, one person in artisanal mining. But with those trends, climate change and commodity shortages that are forecasted, especially for critical minerals that are key for transition from fossil fuels to mineral-based economies, we expect that there's going to be a big influx of artisanal mining activity. And so we need to think about how can we harness the potential, economically speaking, and use ASM as a source to meet the growing demand, but also from a development perspective. How can we ensure that some of the evils or the challenges that we are aware of are not perpetuated or increased? And on the other side, how can we make sure that those people have dignified, safe working conditions, and we actually build prosperity in communities that are often impoverished and don't have many options other than mining to engage with? And so we need to start thinking about how can we engage, build capacity, and a big part to that is investment. That's why we set up the Impact Facility to channel investment through blended finance into these communities. And rather than imposing ESG requirements as a technical barrier to engage in trade, we should think about how can we enable compliance with ESG requirements. Because ESG has the S for social at its center, and that's often dismissed. We think about governance and regulatory compliance and environmental concerns, especially about carbon footprint, first and foremost, because that's easy to quantify and tick a box. But there's huge potential for actually uplifting community and providing work to millions of people across different commodities. And we need to just always keep in mind, compliance is there to protect vulnerable people across the supply chain. In the context of artisanal mining, that means the mining communities where the minerals come from. In China, around factories, that means the factory workers. When it comes to recycling, we can think about the formal and informal recycling industry and the waste pickers that are involved in that and potentially exposed to chemicals. But we need to think, how can we protect their interests to make sure that the products we use and that give us a lot of benefit in day-to-day life are actually done in a way that relates to our, or is in line with our own expectations for ethics.
So some people might, so I think you made a good case that that there's a need and there's opportunity to transform a sector, especially when it comes to artisanal and small-scale mining, but other informal sectors as well. But beyond the regulatory pressures, which don't yet reach as far up as that in terms of obligations for downstream companies and corporate reputations, what is the reason, or isn't there a business reason to engage? You made the case that we should engage, or companies should engage rather than disengage, but everything you've just described could be a very good reason not to become involved in these supply chains and just further expose yourself to these compliance and reputation risks. So what is a reason to engage? And isn't part of the answer to do with there's a business case? At the end of the day, we're entering into a new minerals age. a lot of these minerals are supplied by, produced by informal communities. Is there a business reason to build supply chain resiliency through engagement?
Probably not in the short term with many of these challenges, but in the medium to long term, bigger picture, we are anticipating commodity shortages, especially in the critical mineral space, that in the past, if we looked at what happened during COVID with the chip shortage and subsequent price surges and difficulties of getting specific devices, or the huge increase in cost of secondhand cars in the US car market, because we were unable to actually meet demand. And the context, some of which you've touched on in your introduction, is that there's been a geopolitical polarization where it's very much now the West against China, and by declaring something strategic or critical, claiming a stake and saying we want to be able to control these parts of our supply chains that are vital to enable a continuation of the living standard that we've established over the last decades. And so we need to look at new sources for minerals, and we need to offer something that is of interest to the producers upstream. And at the moment, they don't have any trouble selling any of their materials. They're looking for a better deal. And so as we look for partners that can provide long-term security of supply and deliver something, we need to start thinking about those as a source that has been historically ignored by Western companies, but can be strategically engaged and at the same time make a huge difference to the people on the ground. But key to that is also, again, collective action and not asking a company to figure this out across a wide range of several dozen minerals by themselves, but see how we can engage with industries through groups and like-minded organizations.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned collective action, which is a sort of segue to something that always comes up with us. When maybe two things is our clients ask us, well, where do we begin? We source 50 to 150 different minerals and materials in our supply chain, and who should we respond to first? And when we're framing this and thinking about this with our clients is, on one hand, it's very easy to respond to the stakeholders that are shouting the loudest, that are most shrill in their protestations. But this approach isn't necessarily the best use of a company's time and resources. So you need a way to prioritize that meets both the company's needs, but also gets to the root cause of the problem. And so we've developed over the years several methodologies and saliency methodologies which help companies look at what is the most urgent problem, something which is going to have an impact tomorrow, what is the most severe in terms of its gravity, and what is the most legitimate, and very importantly, where do we have the opportunity as a company to use our influence to actually kind of bring about change and hopefully address both the risk to the company and also the risk to the people in the different communities and in the supply chain, because all companies have a limited influence. Even the biggest companies, some of which you mentioned, don't have a very large influence in the supply chains on which they rely. And this really comes to the collective action piece, which you might want to reflect on things like the Fair Cobalt Alliance. I'll come to that in a minute. So, where companies can't act individually to bring about change or manage the risk through their supply chains, supplier code of conduct, for example, what I've found over the last 30 years is that they are more willing to come together in what people now call this pre-competitive setting. So the first one I was involved in this was something called the Energy and Biodiversity Initiative back in 2000, where the NGO I was working for, Conservation International, brought together 5 big oil and gas companies and 5 large conservation groups, and we entered into a dialogue for 3 or 4 years to come out with a set of standards and actions to address biodiversity when oil and gas took place. And it was a very strange phenomenon at the time. I mean, we were always surrounded by lawyers and kind of very concerned about sort of antitrust and so on and so forth. But now it's become much more commonplace and almost a science and certainly a lawyer's practice. And we've been involved in or lead quite a few of these now. The Colour Gemstone Working Group, for example, just started working with Solar Power Europe and Solar Energy UK on something called the Solar Stewardship Initiative. We've been building the Lead Battery 360 project, and we're working now to develop something on pharma packaging and circularity in the UK as well. And groups like TDi Sustainability and the Global Battery Alliance are kind of active in our space. So I guess my question here really back to you, David, is about the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which you mentioned previously, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative. Can you talk a little about that and how that is actually helping to address these root problems?
Great, and apologies for going back and forth on the slides. I was looking for a slide, but I don't think it has made the final deck. The Fair Cobalt Alliance is a multi-stakeholder initiative, so it brings together civil society and companies. We've got a bit more than 20 members at the moment, including some big companies, Google, Tesla, Glencore, China Moly, which are two large mining organizations in Congo. But on the founding side, we had Signify and Fairphone involved that have a smaller stake in the cobalt industry, but as downstream actors, felt that collective responsibility to mobilize and take action together. And some of those companies previously held policies where they said, we're not purchasing from DRC, we're not purchasing from ASM, and then publicly revised and came out with statements of saying, actually, ASM is not a bad thing in itself. ASM as it currently exists, so our artisanal mining as it currently is being conducted is something we don't want to have or cannot have in our supply chain, but we want to enable compliance with international norm, and as such start sourcing ASM material in the future. And so that's a complete U-turn, even for large mining companies, going from do not engage and basically negate the presence of artisanal miners on their concessions to saying we have a role to enable and empower these communities and ensure that any work that happens in or around our concessions is done in a dignified and responsible way. Meanwhile, there's still a lot of talk about reducing or eliminating cobalt from the supply chain, largely driven by the very complex challenges that are associated with the sector. But many experts believe that it won't be possible to completely get rid of cobalt, at least not in the next 5 to 10 years. And so we will continue to be linked to these communities. And because of that, there is a need to engage, and as you pointed out, do that through a pre-competitive environment. I sometimes joke that there's enough misery for everyone. There's no reason for us to compete on social programs, but we need to actually, first of all, be transparent about successes and failures, because this is not easy on a day-to-day basis. We need to showcase what works and what doesn't, and avoid that other people make the same mistakes that we've made. And then we need to find ways how we can scale and replicate successful things. And for that, you need resources and you need a market signal. So it was really important for us to get companies to actually say, we're interested in sourcing ASM material. We're interested in having cobalt in our supply chain. Part of the responsible sourcing mix is getting responsibly produced ASM material into our products. And a fun side fact on cobalt is that because it's mined through largely manual means, the carbon footprint of the product is very low compared to cobalt from other sources. And so it's not all bad necessarily. Also, some of our members, as I said, we were co-founded by Fairphone. They are small, they are tiny, they don't have leverage over their supply chain. And yet they have a role to play in leading by example. And Fairphone is great in that regard because they went from being an activist to actually setting up a business and showing the big guys how it can be done. And their very comprehensive and holistic concept looks at all stages of the life cycle, including being able to repair your device. And I think a week or two ago, Nokia has announced that from now on, all their phones are going to be repairable, and they're going to support consumers in doing that. And that can be, maybe not directly, but indirectly be attributed to Fairphone that has been banging the drum for the last 10 years and saying, if you can't own it, if you can't open it, you don't own it. And we need to reduce, reuse, recycle. And so that's hugely important.
That's great. And you talk about the need for investment. So at the moment in TDI, we're working with the EU Commission to review the Conflict Minerals Act, which came in last year, the year before last, to understand better its effectiveness. So there have been different kind of regulatory or soft regulatory instruments that have reached up to the DR Congo and other parts of East Africa and the world. Over the last 10 years, really, or since 2010, do you think that from your perspective then, from the impact facilities, that these aren't sufficient, that they're not working and we still need investment? And, you know, perhaps also reflect a little bit on the work you're doing in the Lake Victoria Gold Programme as well, and how that is working. That's a little bit different from the proposition that is happening with the cobalt.
Sure, and just with an eye on time, Assheton, I'll try to be quick to touch on some other elements as well, but regulation is often well intended, and sometimes there's been a rush to market with this. That's especially a criticism that was associated with the Dodd-Frank Act that took away the livelihood of thousands of miners that worked in the 3TG sector, tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold in Congo. And so regulation itself is not a magic bullet. And as I said, people interpret regulation in a way that in order to be compliant, it's easier to disengage. And fact is that there are many companies across the world that are not following a best practice on ESG. And so there will always be someone that's willing to purchase at the conditions that currently persist. And if we care about sustainability and increasing the livelihoods of the people on the ground, we need to step in, engage, and invest. That has potential benefits. As I said, we can forge long-term relationships with these producers if we offer a better deal, meaning that we enable compliance with these standards and bring about more productive, more efficient, more profitable ways of working. This is in their best interest as well. But there's also a business case to invest. It is astounding to me. Artisanal mining, by definition, hasn't received any informal investment. If we only look at copper and cobalt, which occurred in the same deposits in Congo, the sector was worth more than $1 billion in 2021 on the back of 150,000 people that engage in the sector. Now, for me, that's fantastic. A bootstrapped sector that is able to provide somewhere between 10 and 15% of global supply of anything. If we thought about investing not 1 or 2 million, but if we actually looked at the scale and invested commensurate to that, if we invested 100, 200, $300 million into improving conditions, into making it more efficient, into making it better, in aggregation, these mines produce more than some of the largest producers in the world. So there's an opportunity to step in, and that's an opportunity that has been recognized, especially by the US government recently, that entered into an MOU with the DRC to support the formalization of the sector, and even beyond that, look into investing into battery manufacturing on the continent to see how we can have more value addition done in the DRC, so that rather than extracting ore or concentrates, they are exporting something that is closer to a finished product and can be then of direct benefit to downstream users that want to integrate that into their supply chain. As we do this, we need to, and that's across the supply chain and across the globe, we need to contextualize ESG performance. And that means we need to build on the notion of continuous improvement. It's great to aspire best practices, and if we source from Norway or Sweden or Australia, we should stick to those and demand those from the get-go. But if we want to be inclusive of currently marginalized producers or producers that are part of the informal economy, we need to figure out how we can raise ESG performance over time. And that is possible. From a compliance perspective, that is possible, as long as you're not in conflict with the OECD Annex 2 risks, so directly contributing to the worst forms of business conduct as such. There's an encouragement to engage and enable better performance.
That's great. And of course, and I think by investing into the formalization of these informal parts of the supply chain, you then address not only the root problem of that, the governance problems and the problems around poverty, but also the reputation risk and the compliance risk as well. But you mentioned the challenges for reporting, and perhaps we can kind of finish on this, on reporting, CSR reporting, and potential greenwashing, which is going to become more and more important as it becomes mandatory in the Eurozone next year to have sustainability reports for all different sizes of organizations. And of course, reporting is incredibly important. This is how a company can demonstrate that it is conformant, that it is meeting its stakeholders' expectations, and tell its own story about sustainability. But we have become, from our point of view, obsessed with KPIs and measures which are going to have a consequence that is sometimes perverse. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we fail to contextualize many of those data points. We focus on a particular number or a particular outcome, but not on the context in which it is, and that can be misread. I mean, I'll give you an extreme example. Years ago, we were working with a jewelry company, and we took them up to the gold mine where they sourced where they sold some of their gold. And this was a partly artisanal mine, and in this artisanal setting, in a Central American river, beside the riverbed, beside the river shore, there were children working in the shallow waters there, and near to their parents. And of course, the jewelry company said, "Oh, well, this is a breach. This is child labor. There's presence of children on the site." But if you look from a different perspective, there wasn't any childcare in the area. The mothers had to work, and this was the safest, in fact, the cleanest area where they could work. So without that context, the measure of children being present at a mine site could be misunderstood. And so one of our fears is that the laudable attention on corporate accountability and the regulations that are being put in place to address some of society's ills and problems could actually backfire. You can actually be kind of judged incorrectly for a particular action you take, and it can lead to you disengaging rather than engaging. And I think there's an example with our co-founder of the impact facility, Fairphone, correct, David, when it came to their sustainability reports.
Yeah, interesting, and linked to the ambition of becoming carbon neutral, which is obviously an imperative as we look at meeting climate targets. But Fairphone astonishingly managed to integrate Fairtrade Gold into their phone. So it was Fairtrade certified gold that came from communities that received a premium, adhered to best practices in terms of mercury reduction and some of the other challenges that exist around the gold mining sector. But then when compared in eco ratings with other phones, a phone that would purchase recycled gold, which is readily available on the market, was ranked higher than Fairphone would be, because the carbon footprint of the recycled gold, for example, is lower than of mined gold by definition. And so I think once we focus on a specific indicator rather than looking at the bigger picture, that's where we train for a tick box exam as such, and it's easy to lose track of the wider objective, which should be a product that benefits as many people as possible. Assheton, would it be possible for you to maybe bring a couple of thought-provoking statements up and look at how we could go into a Q&A for at least 5 to 10 minutes, which might mean that we run 3, 4, 5 minutes over time. And I very much enjoyed the conversation so far, so that calls for continuation, as there's other things we haven't touched on yet. But maybe you can, tie it together, and then we can go into the Q&A.
So if I look at some of the themes which I think have come out today, I mean, I think is one I've tried to articulate in other presentations. I call it from ESG to SDG. So this is, how can companies not only focus on their immediate compliance needs with the very strong force of regulatory requirements coming to their shores, but also, or alternatively, focus on the root causes of the problems, the SDGs. How can you kind of practically make that happen? And one of the things we suggested is by working in groups and pre-competitive settings, so resources and knowledge can be pooled. And I think related to that as well is about measurements. So how can we actually kind of begin to report on the contribution to the SDGs and not just on compliance? Have we got the right instruments to do that? Or is the emphasis so strongly on the ESG compliance part that we're forgetting about the SDG? And again, you know, this is in the face of the EU coming up this year and next year with regulations on corporate reporting, on regulations on greenwashing, and, you know, on the investment side, the different type of taxonomies as well for investing into green companies. I think there's another theme here that we got to, which is around, you know, prioritization. In the middle of this polycrisis that we're facing and the multiple things, how do we actually kind of prioritize? And related to that, I think, is how can we prioritize it on what we, the company, have discovered is the place where we can have the most influence and trigger change, rather than be driven by the demands from different interest groups and rights groups. But I think this is all to say that I think we all realize we're in a very difficult, companies, our clients and our partners are in difficult position in figuring this out. But there are quite a few examples where there are platforms that are moving ahead and tackling some of these challenges head on. But we certainly have a few minutes left if there's any questions. And David,
one quick follow-up, Assheton. Some of the people on the call work in sustainability or responsible sourcing departments. Do you have any advice on, or do you have any experience from your years of consulting, how at the time of limited budgets and competing requests or demands on resources, also new regulatory infringements, they can make the case internally? Is there a silver bullet that people can lean on?
No, that's a good question. I mean, so I think it goes back to the beginning in that certainly in times of tight budgets and the recession that we're facing now, that anything on sustainability has to be accompanied by a business case. But I think the business case isn't just something that you can pluck from a tree. A business case is built and it is persuaded, and you have to show the long-term value to the senior management. So senior management there is to look after the company, to build value over decades, not just over the next year. So identifying what is lasting, identifying what is core and what is the root of the problem, I think is an easier way to build a business case than demonstrating that you're reacting to the most shrill commentator at the moment. So work on the fundamentals. You know, we work in the investment community and we combine fundamental analysis with ESG analysis to enable to make the case to, you know, red-blooded capitalists how ESG can be incorporated into their information set when they're making investments.
Great. We've got 3 minutes left. If there are any questions from the people that have joined us today, feel free to unmute or use the chat box. I'm not sure you're actually able to unmute, so then in that case, use the chat box. But maybe as we wait for a question, what will be priorities for TDI moving forward in this space?
Well, one of the priorities for this year is enabling really what we call kind of democratizing corporate sustainability. So how can we package what we have learned over the last 20 years or so around corporate sustainability and the tools and make it available for those companies who don't have the large budgets that some of the bigger companies have. So we launched last year TDi Data and Digital, and TDi Data and Digital will be providing over the next 12 months or so a series of portals and platforms that provide information on voluntary sustainability standards, on public issues, regulations, and on industry initiatives to better help companies navigate this area and have at hand the tools they need to more quickly and efficiently put in place the corporate sustainability measures that they need to be compliant and also to meet their own values and sustainability goals.
Thanks, Assheton. Ranjini just asked if there's a best practice document, an ISO of sorts for ESG in its entirety.
Well, that's
or any other resources. And
yeah, I think
ask if
I mean,
ask if there were 2 or 3 days of coaching that could be provided on this agenda to senior leaders in mining companies.
Yes, so I think the ISO family of standards are good around management systems. So any one of the ISO standards can teach individuals and professionals in companies about how to put in place a management system. A management system is really kind of a core to everything, of course, because they help you to identify issues, anticipate those issues, and put in place the protocols for managing them and resolving them over time. That's for sure. But the thing about mining, as David said, I did my PhD looking at mining and sustainability. And one reason I did that because it was so complex and interesting. It has so many different aspects and facets. It is a huge topic. It's a kind of a confluence of all issues from biodiversity to indigenous peoples to community to pollution and so on. So yes, there are some courses that you can do, but in some ways it's a longer learning. But we'd be happy to point you in the right direction, and we can send you some of those courses and resources.
Perfect. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Assheton. Hope to see you soon, and thank you everybody for joining in. There will be the recording that's being made available. Any of our previous and subsequent webinars are also available on our website. So if you haven't seen them, please feel free to check out our website and get in touch if you have any follow-up questions.
Good to see you, David, and hope to see you when you're over here next.